Hello, I'm Nick Warburton, Acting Editor of Irish Magazine, and welcome to our roundtable discussion on the new International Management Standard ISO 45001. Over the past year, our magazine has covered the standard in detail. In March last year, when the standard was launched, we ran a roundtable with auditors looking at what companies can do to best prepare. And then earlier this year, in January, we ran an article looking at the experiences of early registrants and some of the challenges and opportunities that they have faced in the early stages. I'm delighted to be joined today by 4 industry experts who are going to discuss some of the issues that were raised in both of these, and I'm just going to ask them to introduce themselves.
Jared Higgins, Antaris Consulting. We assist companies to implement the various management systems. We ourselves are certified to 4 of them, including ISO 45001.
Hello, I'm Martin Cottam of Lloyd's Register. I chair the ISO Technical Committee 283, which is the owner of the ISO 45001 standard and is publishing other standards in the OHS space.
Hello, I'm Terry Fisher, the Principal Assessor for OHS Management Systems at NQA.
Kate Field, Global Product Champion for Health and Safety at BSI, British Standards Institution.
Thank you. I think a good place to start would be to reflect on the past year since the standard was launched on the 12th of March. Early registrants obviously have had different starting points, but I think what would be good to do would be to look at some of the experiences that they've had. I'm going to ask Gerard just to start to sort of give us an outline of what your sort of key sort of observations have been.
Our experience has been that companies that are early starters have generally had a positive experience, particularly those companies that have experience of the high-level Annex SL format. We would generally recommend that companies look at the standard very closely and identify the gaps from the OSAS to the transition to ISO 45001. We'll obviously be discussing those throughout the talk, but we have found no great difficulty, particularly where the company had already been certified to OSAS. They have found the transition quite reasonable, and provided they identify the gaps between the 2 standards, they've been managed to implement it quite successfully.
Okay. Terry, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue that we've identified when discussing with clients and doing the assessment process is it's more about the terminology. I think it's the terminology used isn't commonplace, context of the organisation, etc. Isn't common commercial language. So, but once people understand what that's trying to achieve, then it's a straightforward process. It's more of a, oh right, that's what it means. It's the clarification as what that interpretation is. So it's not a barrier as such. It's just that initial interpretation because it's not common commercial language.
Martin?
Well, yeah, I think it's a different journey really for different companies. Those who have familiarity with ISO 9001 and 14001 are already very familiar with the terminology and the high-level structure. And so I think they've found those new concepts like context relatively straightforward, whereas those organisations which perhaps only worked with OSAS 18001 or perhaps didn't have a formal OHS management system have to grapple with the language and the structure at the same time. So I think for those organisations it's been things around worker participation, consultation and participation which have perhaps been a harder challenge.
Kate?
I think the experiences that BSI clients have had are very similar. I mean, we've got clients now from over 27 countries certified to 45001, and it goes across all industries and all sizes of organisations. And I think that's one of the benefits of the standard is it can be tailored to any organisation. But certainly those who are familiar, as we've already heard, with the high-level structure from other standards or have 18001, you know, the migration through to 45001 hasn't been overly complex.
Okay, that's good. We'll come back to some of these themes as the discussion progresses. One of the takeaways from the article we ran earlier this year was that organisations shouldn't make the business fit the standard. What do you think about that? Is that something that you sort of agree with, Martin?
Very much so. I struggle when I hear about organisations trying to configure their management system to fit the structure of the standard or to adjust their terminology and language. It's absolutely, in my view, not the right thing to do. You really need to have a management system which speaks to your own people in their own language, and you can structure that any way you like. What you do need in the background, I think, for ease of auditing, is to have that mapping so that you can readily demonstrate to yourselves and to others the connection between your management system and the standards requirements. But it's much better to do it that way, in my view.
Okay, Kate.
I think, yeah, management systems are tools to enable business, and as a tool, it's up to the organisation to find the best way of actually using that's going to benefit them. And I think, particularly for small businesses, the framework and the language can often be daunting, but actually, it is designed to be accessible. And Martin's absolutely right. It's adapted to your organisation and the language that you use. If you don't like the phrases around consultation on participation, you want to use engagement or something like that, then do so. It's your standard.
Okay. Gerard.
I think the key thing here is context. There's a huge difference between a small office-based company and a large manufacturing company. You have to adopt the standard to meet the requirements or the particular circumstances that the company has to meet. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that you still do have to cover all of the requirements of the standards as well.
Terry.
I think it's got to be understood that it's a part of a business management system, and it's there to support the business and meet its needs, and that's what it's trying to deliver. And although all the clauses are there and the various structures built into the standard requirements, they've got to connect to each other and work as an effective management system, and I think that's the key message. So it doesn't matter what you call it, about what clause or whatever, it's about the effectiveness of the process that is really key.
Okay. Well, on the sort of the topic of process, I mean, one of the things we've sort of touched upon is the differences between OSAS and the new standard. How do you feel companies have sort of coped with those differences from what you've seen? Terry?
I think it's very similar to what we said before. It depends on the journey of the organisation itself. If they're used to the Annex SL high-level structure, then it's perceived as more of an integration. Whereas if it's a migration from the 18 to the 45, the language and the various different structures have kicked in. But once you get past that and this is what it's trying to achieve, then it becomes an open process, and it then isn't as daunting. So it's about that understanding, and I think that's the part of the assessor's role to try and interpret that and make it an easier journey rather than something that is difficult to do.
I think it depends again on the starting point, because we tend to sort of default to the assumption that companies have built their previous management system around a previous standard. Well, actually, of course, some have, and that's often one of the dangers of kind of downward pressure in supply chains, is that people rather reluctantly engage with the idea they have to have a certified system and build it very much to, well, here's the requirements, we better do it. But actually, of course, a lot of organisations don't approach it that way. They're doing it because they believe in it, and they're looking beyond the pure requirements of the standard. So they may already be much more involved with employee engagement than the previous standards required. So again, that journey varies. Many organisations will find relatively little that's different about 45,001.
Okay. Kate?
I think one of the things that I've heard from clients is to read the standard once, twice, and then 3 times. because, you know, it is only an upgrade from 18,001, so there aren't necessarily that many significant differences, but the devil is in the detail, and I think, you know, that's been the challenge where organisations have maybe missed that actually the management review there are some more specific elements that have to be covered, or in participation and consultation, absolutely, you know, if they're using 18,001, if they're based in the UK, they'll be following the legislation, they'll have those systems in place, but there are specific elements that have to be covered either in participation or consultation, so it's really about focusing on that detail.
Well, Kate has alluded to the consultation and participation, but where we found difficulty with some of the clients that we're helping is on the contractor management side. That is definitely more defined, more comprehensive than was the case with OSAS. So it's a very fine line between almost over-managing the contractors and ensuring that they have a proper management system in place that protects their own workers and doesn't impact negatively on your own workforce.
Does anyone want to pick up on that about contractor management?
I was going to say, I mean, I think one of the biggest questions that we've seen is about what outsourcing means. and therefore, you know, and how far the client organisation then has to oversee any outsourcing arrangements. And I think that actually the solution is there in the standard, in as much as the standard says you define it. So, you know, it doesn't suddenly mean that you've got to be going out and auditing all your suppliers. It absolutely doesn't. And I think that was the initial fear. So I think once, you know, that's a conversation to be had with your assessor on the ground if you've got concerns, or that's where doing a gap audit before you start and understanding where you are and where you need to get to, you know, has real benefits.
Okay, Martin?
Well, I guess in a way it also comes back to that phrase of organisational context, doesn't it? It's about having first thought through the entirety of your sort of OHS landscape and thinking about the kind of relationship that you have with suppliers. It's interesting, of course, outsourcing is one of the areas of the high-level structure which is probably likely to be fine-tuned at the next revision, because again we should recognise that backbone to all the management system standards is itself a sort of first revision, and will be tuned again over the next 2 or 3 years. So I think it's recognised that the language isn't as clear perhaps as it could be in that area. And that's where, of course, you know, guidance standards have a part to play with the international ones, or indeed the ones which have been published in the UK by BSI in the last 12 months.
The context of the organisation in itself, once people understand what the standard is trying to achieve and what that means for that particular organisation, I don't think it's a particular barrier. I think it's just getting that understanding initially at that assessment point. And whether that comes from internal gap analysis, external gap analysis, and the assessment process of whatever the migration or the stage 1, stage 2, it's getting that understanding of what the management system is trying to achieve overall, because there's many component parts. And it's not just, oh well, we've done clause 7.2 and we've done clause 6. It's not that. It's about how the management system in its entirety works for that organisation. And there's some really fine-tuned examples that you can use going through that for different organisations, and it can become really effective just by enhancing what's already there in a lot of cases, certainly within is my experience.
Do you want to give some, go into a bit more detail about examples?
Things like contractor and outsourcing and various things. Once you say, well, what do you think the standard's trying to achieve, and you have that discussion, and then generally speaking, the client will go, oh, well, we do this. And they then, there's never any shortage of documented information or evidence there. Once that understanding is there, I've never gone into an organisation where there's a lack of information once they understand what the requirement is. Generally, you have to shut the floodgates as opposed to sort of drag it out of them. It's a matter of making that subtle distinction about what you're trying to achieve and why you're trying to achieve it, rather than just the quote of 7 point, etc., or the various clauses. it's making the client understand what you're trying to achieve, I think, is the critical path.
Does anybody want to add anything to what Terry said?
I think one of the really good examples that I saw from one of our clients was they went through the standard clause by clause, but they simply asked, so what? So what? So what does that mean? What have we got? What do we need to do? But what they did, which I thought was really clever, was they captured it, but they captured it in just simple language, because then when they were having conversation with their wider workforce, they had something that was meaningful to them, rather than, and we're all guilty of it. I mean, we've already done it here today. It's very easy to click into auditor speak and talk about clause or context or participation or outsourcing, but that's the language of the standard, and it doesn't necessarily translate into the language of the business. And I thought that was a really simple but effective solution.
I'd have to say that companies that had previously migrated to ISO 9001 and ISO 14001 had a much better understanding of the terminology, and didn't have any difficulty with some of the new terminology like documented information or context or interested parties.
Okay, that's interesting. For companies that are, we've talked a little bit about sort of the early registrants, but for those sort of looking to certify to the new standard, what sort of coming to it afresh, what should they be looking to prioritise now?
I think I've heard time and time again from our clients that doing a gap audit, either getting somebody externally in or doing it internally, is a really important starting point, because that benchmarks where you are, and then it can help prioritise where you need to go to. I think the other area that's worth considering early is around culture, and actually how you're going to manage culture, and how you're going to demonstrate how you measure it, and then demonstrate continual improvement, because that's a key theme within 45001, which is different to any existing international management standard. I mean, you even in 18001, it doesn't expressly talk about culture. It's absolutely underlying, because it's so important for health and safety, but it is expressly required within 45001. So thinking early on, okay, how can we measure this? How can we demonstrate that we're doing something about it, and how do we do that, for continual improvement?
I think the first thing is exactly that, for the clients to do some form of gap analysis as to what they're trying to achieve and where they are at that moment in time. Because a lot of organisations do understand what they're there for as a commercial entity, but when you start asking about, well, how do you communicate, how do you engage with work, then that's a totally different question. They may have we've got these formal mechanisms of this committee and that. Does it work? How do you know it works? And those sort of challenges are quite new. So we're going into a more in-depth assessment of the effectiveness of that process, rather than, oh yes, you do this quarterly meeting or whatever. Well, what are you achieving by that? Show me. Why are you doing that? That's the challenge, and I think that it's a challenge to both parties, really, both the clients and assessors, because it's a different approach. And I think it's really effective. And to be fair, I think the way that the standards are written, they shouldn't need lots of fine tuning year on year or whatever, lots of revision. They're written quite well, so they should stand the test of time.
Oh, unquestionably a gap analysis which would serve two purposes: one, to identify the gaps, and two, to make the company conversant with the new terminology, the Annex SL terminology.
Okay. Martin, do you want to add anything?
Same advice, I guess, from me. I think the gap analysis is important. One of the things I would say about doing the gap analysis is don't start at section 4 of the standard, which is a very common thing to do. Section 3 in particular, which is the definitions, I think is quite important with this particular standard, particularly for those who are not as familiar with ISO 9001 and 14001, because there's been quite a big shift in terminology in the high-level structure, and people tend to assume that they know what the terms mean, but actually if something's defined in a standard, it's defined specifically because the dictionary definition isn't really adequate to convey the meaning. So although it seems a bit tedious, I would recommend looking quite closely at the definitions and looking at the text. And to Kate's point, you probably need to go through it 2 or 3 times to really absorb it. And then it's that question of saying, okay, that's what it's saying, but what does it actually mean in the context of my organisation? I think it's fair to say it's easy to read these standards as having been written and more applicable to larger organisations. The high-level structure kind of uses a terminology which kind of speaks a little bit about larger organisations. It's not intended to mean that the standards and the principles don't apply to smaller organisations, but I sometimes think it's a bit of a harder exercise to think through, actually we're doing this, or actually this is quite simple. I think communication is a great example of that. If you're a large multinational, you do have quite a job to do to think about how to communicate across time zones and cultures. If you're a small organisation with a few people co-located in one place, that communication's a natural process. You don't need to plan it in great detail. So I think that's it's that stepping through, understanding, and then relating it to yourselves as an organisation.
Okay, thank you. For those who are sort of looking to embark on the process, one of the sort of takeaways from the article that we ran earlier this year in January from the early registrants was that companies should continue to use a manual to record and document the management systems. Is that something that you would sort of concur with?
So I think, so as a health and safety professional, I think one of the things that you see over the years and you get incredibly frustrated about is these huge manuals, these documents that gather dust and sit on a shelf, which are completely unusable to anybody. And I think, that's what's so nice about 45001 is that it moves away from having documented procedures to having documented information. And I think really importantly in the annex of the standard it talks about that any documented information that you do need, and there are elements that are required to be documented information within the standard, but they are proportionate, and it talks about very much making sure that you're moving away from a bureaucratic system to something that is easy and manageable, and using technology. And I think that's one of the things that we've seen our clients really move to is using technology to record information, and again it's not about necessarily written word, but pictures or videos or animations or whatever it happens to be. There's much more flexibility for being more innovative in terms of how you demonstrate those elements.
That's interesting. That comes on to the next question I was going to ask, which is around, have you sort of seen any innovative approaches to documenting information? Martin?
We're seeing lots of people seeing the opportunity of the new standard to realise that they don't need a shelf full of paperwork. And I think my advice would be start from thinking about what are the essentials, what is the minimum, and don't over elaborate it. Certainly HSE colleagues who participated in the UK Mirror Committee in the development of 45001 were quite passionate about the word proportionate, and really keen to make sure that message comes through loud and clear. And I think the UK Mirror Committee shared that view that it's a really important message. But I think there's all sorts of things that can be done to improve the delivery of information to people with technology. My own organisation, Lloyd's Register, is now delivering some of its management system information to technical colleagues in the field on a mobile phone app. And it's just so much improved the accessibility. So sometimes it's not actually about what the documentation is, it's the form and its accessibility, and you don't necessarily have to change the documents. You can get much more impact simply by changing the delivery mechanism.
Okay. What's your experience in the Republic of Ireland?
Our experience is that we don't encourage companies to undergo metamorphosis when they go from the old to the new standard. Certainly look at the documentation they have and try to rationalise documents that are obsolete or redundant. But we find that the manual is a very good signposting document. What we do is encourage companies maybe to go for an integrated management system manual, particularly in light of the migration to the Annex SL. It affords companies the opportunity to have a single manual that covers all of the management systems that they have implemented in the company.
Terry?
I think the use of a manual is dependent on the organisation. You're there to meet the needs of that organisation. I think a lot traditionally have carried over or is a comfort blanket for the older versions of the various standards. A manual has become integrated into where management systems are done. And to some extent, I would turn around and say, okay then, so what benefit is that manual delivering to you now? Is it something you just dust off the shelf 2 days before the assessor arrives and therefore, then you would question, well, why do we maintain that? What value is it actually adding to the business? Or is the evidence and the information that we're looking at actually live information that's going on in the processes and the activity of the organisation? That's what you've got to ask yourself, because it should be that it's a live activity integrated into the normal operation of the business, not this, oh, well, we make XYZ service or product, and by the way, we do some health and safety with this manual as an add-in. And that's not what this management system is trying to achieve. And I think it's difficult to take people away from that comfort blanket of, I've got this manual. I've always worn this jacket. I wear this,
But do you not feel that if you go into a company for the first time and they have a nice, concise manual, it's the easiest way of understanding how they structure their own management system or systems?
I think it's the effectiveness of how it works for them. If it works for them, manuals are great. Yeah. And I think that's the message from the standard. I think it should be perceived as a far more flexible document now than it ever has been across all the disciplines. The Annex SL framework has brought in management system flexibility that needs to be applied to a particular organisation, not this, the only way to do this is take step A, B, C, D. That's not what it's about. It really is about flexibility and delivering need and requirement for that organisation. So if a manual works, great. And if it doesn't, or if you think actually I don't really, we've got this because it's something traditionally that we've done, then it may be time to review it or reduce it or eliminate it over time. Development, continual improvement.
We'll come back to continued improvement as we progress.